About 2 months ago, I made a video called the Regions of Middle-earth, where I talked about the largest regions in the Westlands. So it's only natural that I make a sequel to that video. This time, let's talk about the regions of Beleriand, Ardgallan, Doriath, Dorthonion, East Beleriand, Hiflum, Lothlan, Nevrast, Assyriand, Thargelion, and West Beleriand. Let's talk about what they looked like, who lived there, and a little bit about their history. Before I start, I want to say that this video was a little bit more difficult to do than the Regions of Middle-earth video. The reason for this is that the regions in Middle-earth are very clearly defined by large geographical boundaries. Rohan is really the only region that is divided by political lines. The same isn't really true for Beleriand. While some regions are absolutely geographically defined, others aren't so much, defined more by politics. The reason for this is that Beleriand's size is misleading. It's really only the size of Eriador, so there's a lot more crammed into a much smaller space, and unfortunately in some of the regions not that much actually happens. Let's start with Ardgallan, the Green region. Located north of Beleriand proper, Ardgallan was a large grassy plain with no real major landmarks that separated Angband from the rest of Beleriand. In the west, Ardgallan's boundary were the mountains of Eredwethrin. In the north, it was the Iron Mountains, where Morgoth's dominion lay. In the south, it was the gently sloping hills of Dorthonion, and in the east, it was roughly a line that ran north from the eastern hills of Dorthonion. Despite being a pleasant country in the beginning, no one lived in Ardgallan. The reason for this is obvious. It was a flat plain, hemmed in on three sides by hills and mountains. It ran right up to the gates of Angband. In other words, Ardgallan was the perfect location for a battlefield, and to no one's surprise, after the return of the Noldor to Middle-earth, much of the Dagor Nuin Gileath and the Dagor Aglareb were fought on Ardgallan. Afterwards, the Noldor realized that Morgoth could not be allowed to cross the plain unchecked, so they created the Siege of Angband, and a series of watchtowers and camps were constructed across the plain. Unfortunately, Ardgallan would be the first casualty when the Siege of Angband was broken. Morgoth unleashed rivers of fire across the plain to incinerate his enemies, and the plain was left scorched and charred beyond recognition. From this point on, it was known as Anfalglyph, the Gasping Dust, a totally inhospitable place. Still, Anfalglyph served as the battlefield for several more major battles, including the Nirnaeth Anoediad and the climactic battle of the War of Wrath. Afterwards, the land, ruined beyond all hope of rehabilitation, was sunk alongside the rest of Beleriand. The next is Doriath, the Land of the Fence. Primarily known as a kingdom, Doriath was also the name of a collection of forests in central Beleriand. There were four main forests: the Holy Forest of Region, the Beech Forest of Neldoreth, the two small forests known as Nivrim, mostly made of oak, and Arthorion. Brethil and Nan Elmoth were also once considered part of Doriath, but became politically independent following the arrival of the Noldor and Men. As part of Doriath, I also included its border marches, the silent empty plains of Dimbar and Dor Dainan, and of course the accursed valley of Nandungatheb, where one could find giant spiders, the spawn of Ungoliant. While the first people to pass through Doriath were the Noldor, Doriath became mostly known for being the main kingdom of the Sindarin elves, led by King Elu Thingol and his wife, Melian the Maya. From his seat in Menegroth, Thingol claimed sovereignty over all of Beleriand, but the return of Morgoth proved that he couldn't really back up that claim. After the first battle, many Sindar from across Beleriand fled into Doriath, and many Green Elves from Assyrian took up residence in Arthorion. Choosing to consolidate their defences, Melian created the Girdle of Melian, a magical barrier that stopped anyone from entering Doriath without her or Thingol's permission. Those who did often found a quick end in the forest. As a kingdom, Doriath was as neutral as one could be in the wars against Morgoth, only really participating when its lands were directly threatened. Unfortunately, the Girdle of Melian could not protect from enemies within. Thingol was murdered by dwarves, and Melian disappeared, her girdle dissipating. Doriath was then sacked by dwarves seeking revenge, but the kingdom briefly recovered under the rulership of Dior, Thingol's grandson. This lasted only a few years. Due to his possession of a Silmaril, Dior became the target of the Feanorians, and Doriath was sacked a second time. This time, it did not recover, and the forests became silent and empty. The region directly to the north of Doriath is Dorthonion, the land of the pine trees. Dorthonion was a highland region mostly covered in pine forests. In the north, where the hills met Ardgallan, the slopes were gentle, but they rose sharply in the south before ending in sheer cliffs at Ered Gorgoroth. In the east, the hills bordered the plain of Lothland, and in the west they looked over the valley of Sirion. I also included the encircling mountains and the valley of Tomladen, where one could find the hidden city of Gondolin, as part of the region of Dorthonion. Like the rest of Beleriand, Dorthonion did receive some Sindarin settlers, although not many owing to the region's proximity to Angband. When the Noldor returned, a group led by the brothers Angrod and Egnor also took up residence in Dorthonion, holding it as vassals to King Fendrod Feligund in Nargothrond. While not in Dorthonion proper, Turgon would also found his hidden kingdom of Gondolin within the protection of the encircling mountains. Later, Dorthonion also became home to the men of the House of Beor, who were gifted the region of Ladros as a fief due to their friendship with Nargothrond. Unfortunately, this happy little mix came crashing down during the Dagor Bragollach. Dorthonion was overrun, and most of its inhabitants were killed or driven off. Only a small remnant of the House of Beor remained to fight for their land. Afterwards, Dorthonion underwent a terrifying transformation, becoming Tal Nu Fuin, the forest under Nightshade. Largely due to the efforts of Sauron, the land was horrifically corrupted, the trees became deadly, the forests became infested with monsters, and all good things fled the land. Although Dorthonion was briefly retaken, this did not last, and it fell under Morgoth's control once again, becoming a staging ground for his orcs to invade the rest of Beleriand. Interestingly, significant parts of Dorthonion were one of the few places to survive the sinking of Beleriand, surviving as the large island known as Tol Fuin. Perhaps the largest region of Beleriand was East Beleriand. The region can roughly be defined as the rivers Sirion and Aros in the west, the river Gelion in the east, the hills belonging to the March of Maedhros in the north, and the southern extent of the vast forest of Tau Im Duinaf in the south. East Beleriand has two known subregions, Himlad, a flat plain between the river Aros and Kelon, and the plain of Estelad south of the forest of Nan Elmoth. While most of East Beleriand is made up of flat plains, due to its size it also has a lot of geographical diversity. It has forests, such as the small one of Nan Elmoth and the vast one of Tau Im Duinaf. What they have in common is that they're both dark and gloomy. There's hills. In the north are the hills that belong to the March of Maedhros, and in the centre is the uniquely shaped long line of hills known as Andram. There's also larger, more important peaks such as Himring and Amon Ereb. Like much of Beleriand, East Beleriand was originally home to many Sindarin elves who traded foodstuffs to the elves who dwelt in the forests. We're also told that a few dark elves, the Avari, dwelt in the vast woods of Tau Im Duinaf. But after the return of the Noldor, it became the main domain of the Feanorians. Himring became the fortress of Maedhros. Maglor took the land between the two arms of the Gelion. Celegorm and Curufin became the lords of Himlad, and Amrod and Amras dwelt in the wide lands around Amon Ereb. Later, men would establish themselves in Estelad. A mixed people would remain there even after the other Mamish lords were established. East Beleriand was no stranger to war. One part of the first battle took place at Amon Ereb, where King Denethor of the Green Elves was slain. Afterwards, the land was valiantly defended by the Feanorians, but they were largely defeated during the Dagor Bragollach, with only Himring and Amon Ereb holding out. During this time, the men of Estelad also fled. The Feanorians did restore their lands in the lead up to the Nunneath Anuidiad, but after that catastrophe, their power was broken and they mostly abandoned their lands. At least part of East Beleriand survived as part of Lindon after the sinking of Beleriand, and Himring survived as its own island. Although not a part of Beleriand proper, one of the most important regions of the First Age was Hiflum, the land of mists. Hiflum was a cold, rainy, yet fertile region that was almost entirely surrounded by mountains, the Ered Weathrin to the east and south, and Ered Loman to the west. In the north, there was a gap in the mountains that made the region vulnerable to Angband. Hiflum also had two subregions divided by the mountains of Mithrim. The mineral-wealthy Mithrim, with Lake Mithrim, was in the east, and Dorloman was in the west. And you guessed it, the first settlers in Hiflum were Sindar, a subgroup known as the Mithrim. These elves were nominally subjects of Doriath, but that changed with the arrival of the Noldor. Hiflum became the first place where the Noldor encamped, and afterwards, Hiflum became their primary realm, ruled by High King Fingolfin. Later, Hiflum was also settled by men belonging to the House of Hador. They were gifted the land of Dorloman to rule as a fief. Unfortunately, Hiflum's last inhabitants weren't so lovely. Easterlings in service to Morgoth were given, or rather imprisoned in Hiflum, and the former inhabitants of the land became their thralls. Under the rules of Fingolfin and his son Fingon, the realm of Hiflum was Morgoth's greatest foe, valiantly holding the Ered Weathrin and the Pass of Sirion against him. However, constant warfare sapped the strength of Hiflum, and it was forced to rely more and more on its allies such as the Men of Dor-lómin and the Falas. After the Noneif Noediad, Hiflum's strength was completely depleted, and Morgoth occupied the land with his Easterling servants. No trace of Hiflum survived the destruction of Beleriand. The next region is Lothland, the wide and empty land, and I'm going to be honest, this is the perfect description of the land because we know very little about it. At first, I was thinking of including it as part of Ardgallen because functionally there isn't much difference between the lands, but the font on the map is so big, so I decided to include it. Like Ardgallen, it's a flat plain, its southern border is the March of Maedhros, the northern border is the Iron Mountains, the eastern border is the Blue Mountains, and the western border is the arbitrary line above the eastern edge of Dorthonion. Like Ardgallen, Lothland was uninhabited, but it also hosted activity during the Siege of Angband. In particular, cavalry under the command of Maglor usually patrolled the plain. Much of this cavalry was wiped out during the Dagor Bragollach, suggesting that Lothland may have met a similar fate as Ardgallen, being burned and reduced to ruin by rivers of flame. Lothland would have been mostly sunk during the loss of Beleriand, but a small southeastern portion of the land may have survived as part of Lindon. Our next region is Nevrast, the hither shore. Nevrast is a triangular-shaped land that is entirely surrounded by mountains. The southern side is probably part of Ered Weathrin, the eastern side is probably Ered Lomin, but I have no idea what chain the western side belongs to or whether it has its own name. While also a rainy land, Nevrast is described as much warmer than Hiflum, with a climate fairly similar to the rest of Beleriand. Much of the region was dominated by a lake called Lenewen and the marshes that surrounded it. Of course, the first settlers were also Sindarin, but they were joined by the Noldor led by Turgon. Turgon would construct a city called Vinyamar at Mount Taras, but this would only be a temporary lodging. Soon afterwards, he and all the people of Nevrast, both Noldor and Sindar, would remove to Gondolin. After that, Nevrast was empty, truly only home to the many species of birds that lived around Lenewen. This emptiness would prove problematic. After Hiflum fell to Morgoth's forces, he set his sights on the Falas, but the powerful realm of Nargothrond was in the way. So instead, Morgoth sent his forces unopposed through Nevrast, and they ended up attacking the Falas from the north. Nevrast, like most other places, did not survive the destruction of Beleriand, so those birds had to find a new home. For the next region, we travel far to the west, to Osiriand, the land of 7 rivers. Osiriand was a green, forested country. Its eastern borders were the Blue Mountains, its western border was the River Gelion, the north was River Askar, and the south was the River Adjurant. It should be obvious that Osiriand's defining features were rivers. The rivers Gelion, Askar, Thalos, Legollin, Brilthor, Dwylwen, and Adjurant made up the 7. At the river of Adjurant was the island of Tol Galen, the Green Island. Osiriand is most well known as being the homeland of the Green Elves, a nature-loving, unwarlike people who lost their one and only king, Denethor, in the first battle. Osiriand was also briefly settled by first groups of men that crossed the Blue Mountains, but the Green Elves petitioned Finrod Felagund to move them on before there were any potential hostilities. And while the Green Elves were reclusive, they weren't against accepting outsiders. They accepted Beren and Luthien, and after their power was broken, the Feanorians also ended up in Osiriand. Osiriand was probably one of the nicest lands to live in during the First Age. It was far from the action and deemed as irrelevant, so even when the rest of Beleriand was overrun by Morgoth, Osiriand seems to have remained mostly untouched. And on top of that, Osiriand was one of the few places in Beleriand that survived the First Age mostly intact. Although the rivers were destroyed, much of the land did survive as the southern region of Lindon, known as Har-Lindon. Directly north of Osiriand was Thargelion, literally meaning across Gelion. Its northern and eastern borders were the Blue Mountains, the southern border was the River Askar, and the western border was the River Gelion. We actually don't have much of a description of Thargelion. If I had to guess, it was probably somewhat like Osiriand, although maybe less wooded. It had a couple of notable features. In the north, there was Lake Helavorn beneath the peak of Mount Reria, and in the south was Mount Dolmed, a significant mountain for the dwarves of the Blue Mountains. We don't know if anyone dwelt in Thargelion before the arrival of the Noldor, but afterwards it became the land ruled by Caranthir, the 4th son of Feanor. Here the Noldor made contact with the dwarves who lived right next to Thargelion and regularly passed through it thanks to the Dwarf Road in the south. Another group that briefly lived in Thargelion was the House of Halef, but after surviving an orc attack, they declined Caranthir's invitation to remain there under his protection. When the Easterlings arrived, the same invitation was extended to them, and the House of Ulfang, those who were loyal to Morgoth, ended up dwelling there until they presumably were also forced to move to Hithlum. Unlike Assyrian, Thargelion was not really spared from war. Caranthir built his fortress at Lake Hellethorn and fortified the mountains above it, but that did not stop the orcs from pouring through Maglor's Gap during the Dagorbrag Lac. Caranthir was defeated and forced to flee south to Amon Ereb, and Lake Hellethorn was defiled. Although the Feanorians recovered Thargelion shortly afterwards, they presumably lost it again following the Nunev Anuidiad. But, like Assyrian, much of Thargelion survived the War of Wrath and remained as the northern part of Lindon for Lindon. And finally, we're left with West Beleriand. West Beleriand is one of the largest regions of Beleriand. Its northern border is the Ered Weathrin, the eastern border is the River Sirion, and the southern and western borders are the shores of Beligea, the Great Sea. West Beleriand has some large subregions too, the Falas, which can be found along the western coast, Vanian, which can be found on the southern coast, and the Realm of Nargothrond, which makes up a huge chunk of the centre of West Beleriand. There's also Brethil, which, while part of the Forests of Doriath, is more politically in West Beleriand. West Beleriand has a vast array of landscapes and features. There's a lot of rivers, the chief of those being the Sirion, the Narog, and the Teiglin. There's a number of hill chains, although interestingly, none of them seem to be named except for the lone hill of Amon Ruth, south of Brethil. There's also a lot of forests. Brethil is the major one, but there's also Nan Tathren, Nimbrathil, and a small forest at Nargothrond known as Tau and Faroth. And finally, there's a bunch of marshlands, the Mouths of Sirion, the Fens of Sirion, and the Pools of Ivrin. West Beleriand is where most of the Sindar outside of Doriath settled. The largest of these groups were the Falathrim, who, under Círdan the Shipwright, founded the Falas. But there was also plenty of wandering groups, many of whom fled to Doriath after the first battle. When the Noldor first arrived, they actually didn't really settle in West Beleriand, at least not until Thingol gave Finrod the location of Nargothrond. When Nargothrond was founded, it became one of the largest and most powerful realms in Beleriand. Eventually, men of the House of Halef would settle in Brethil and in the woodlands across the Teiglin, and for a while, men of the House of Hador would dwell in the southern slopes of Ered Weathrin before moving permanently to Dor Lomin. For many years, West Beleriand was the most peaceful land in Beleriand owing to the sacrifices of Hithlum, but after Hithlum fell, it all began unravelling. The Falas fell only a short year later, and while Nargothrond and Brethil fought desperately to stop Morgoth's forces pushing further into the region, their efforts also ended up being for naught. In the end, Morgoth's enemies were pushed south, and their final outpost on the mainland was at the mouths of Sirion. And after this was destroyed, by the Feanorians I might add, Morgoth controlled the entire region. West Beleriand was completely destroyed after the War of Wrath, except for a tiny island called Tol Morwen, which contained the graves of Morwen and Turin Turambar. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I know some of the region descriptions were rather brief, but as I said at the start of the video, Beleriand in its entirety was only about the size of Eriador, so its subregions were actually quite small, and unlike the rest of Middle-earth, where I had thousands of years of history to work with, Beleriand really only has 500 years of detailed history, and then maybe a few thousand years of vague history. Anyways, cheers, farewell, and remember, the next video will be on the regions of Tom Bombadil's house.